He walked in wearing a hoodie and boots. By the time he reached the table, the waiter had already judged him. But when the insults started flying, no one realized who he really was until one quiet sentence stopped the entire restaurant cold. What was it, and why did it leave everyone speechless? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The valet barely glanced at him when he pulled up. No luxury car, no loud engine purring for attention. Just an old black motorcycle, the paint chipped, the handlebars slightly rusted from weather and wear. Keanu Reeves climbed off slowly, tucking his helmet under his arm. His jeans were faded, the knees soft and worn, his boots scuffed and dusty. A simple gray hoodie hung over his shoulders, zipped halfway up against the chill of a California evening. Leaving, he didn't walk with the swagger of the rich. He didn't check his reflection in the mirror glass door. Instead, he stepped into Lexski's like a man looking for a quiet corner, not a spotlight. Inside, the air was cooled and still, heavy with the scent of truffle oil, imported roses, and polished silver. Light from cascading chandeliers glowed like captured starlight, dancing across white linen tablecloths and crystal flutes filled with wines older than most of the staff. The hum of refined conversation drifted gently across the room. Business titans discussing mergers, movie producers pitching over foie gras and gossip. And then the door opened again, just briefly, and the ambiance shifted. Keanu didn't belong here, at least not by the restaurant's standards. The hostess stand stood directly ahead, sleek and black, lined with a digital reservation tablet that only 2 people were trained to use. Behind it stood Lance. Lance had worked at Lexski's for 6 years. His hair was always slicked back to a perfect sheen, his tie measured and symmetrical, his posture like a statue guarding a bank vault. He wasn't just a waiter, he was the gatekeeper. He decided who got to bask in the glow of the chandeliers and who was quietly turned away with an apology and a smug smile. From the corner of his eye, Lance noticed the figure stepping through the front door, and his expression soured immediately. A hoodie, boots, jeans, no watch, no cufflinks, no tailored suit, no entourage, no stylist. His lips curled into a smirk. To Lance, this man wasn't a customer. He was an interruption. Olivia, the junior hostess, stood nearby, holding 2 menus and watching everything unfold. She had only been working at Lexski's for 3 weeks, and she still believed in the old-fashioned idea that hospitality meant making people feel welcome. She recognized Keanu. Of course she did. But she didn't say anything. Something about the energy in the room told her to stay quiet, and something about the way Lance was already squaring his shoulders told her this wasn't going to end well. Lance straightened his cuffs and stepped forward, walking with the kind of precise, calculated grace usually reserved for high-end runway models and military parades. He didn't approach Keanu as a host. He approached him like a bouncer, about to eject someone from the club. Keanu had stopped just short of the host stand, glancing slowly around the room. He didn't look uncomfortable. He didn't look intimidated. If anything, he looked at peace, like he'd walked into a memory. But Lance didn't see that. He only saw the clothes, the quiet, the lack of effort to impress. He saw what he wanted to see. And in his world, that meant someone who didn't belong. Lance crossed his arms as he approached, the corners of his mouth tight with disdain. "Good evening," he said, his voice polite but unmistakably sharp. "Can I help you?" Keanu turned his head slowly, his dark eyes meeting Lance's without tension. "I have a reservation," he replied, voice low, calm. Lance blinked. "A reservation?" "Yes," Keanu said gently, "under the name Reeves." Lance suppressed a laugh, but his face betrayed the flicker of amusement he didn't manage to hide. He turned halfway, glancing at Olivia, as if to confirm the absurdity of it all. "Olivia," he called over his shoulder, "do we have a Mr. Reeves on the books tonight?" Olivia hesitated, eyes flicking from the tablet to Keanu, then to Lance. "Yes," she said softly. "Table for one. Private corner booth. 8 o'clock." Lance froze for just a breath. Then he recovered, waving her off with a single flick of his fingers. "Must be a mix-up," he said, too quickly. "That booth is reserved for VIPs." Keanu's brow lifted slightly, amused. "So I can't sit there." "It's not the kind of table we assign to walk-ins," Lance replied. "But you just heard," Olivia tried to speak up again. "It's his reservation. It's confirmed." Lance didn't turn to her. He didn't acknowledge her voice. Instead, he took a step forward and narrowed his eyes at Keanu's hoodie. "I'm afraid we have a dress code," he added smoothly. "We request formal wear. Dinner jackets, button-downs, polished shoes." Keanu looked down at his boots, then at his hoodie. He smiled lightly. "I'm warm. And I'm hungry." Lance's jaw tightened. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to return another night, preferably dressed for the occasion." "Let me ask you something," Keanu said, still calm, still not raising his voice. "What exactly are you protecting? The food or the people?" Lance scoffed. "I'm protecting the standards of Lexkis. That includes presentation, class, image." Olivia flinched at the word. Keanu nodded slowly, absorbing the answer. "And if someone doesn't fit your image?" Lance gave a tight smile. "Then maybe this isn't the place for them." The air in the foyer shifted. Two men in tailored suits paused at the door behind Keanu, taking in the scene. A woman in a gown glanced toward the commotion, then whispered something to her date. Keanu looked Lance in the eye. His voice was gentle, but it carried like thunder. "Do you speak to every guest this way?" he asked. "No," Lance said, teeth gritted. "Only the ones who don't belong." A long silence followed. Olivia looked down, unsure what to do. Her fingers curled tighter around the menu she still held, knuckles turning white. This wasn't just another awkward exchange. It was turning into something else. Something she hadn't been trained for. She glanced back at the reservation tablet. There it was. Reeves. Table 12. Confirmed. Yet Lance was pretending none of that mattered. Keanu didn't move. He didn't flinch or argue. He simply studied Lance for a long, quiet moment. Then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "All right," Keanu said. Lance blinked. "All right? If you say I don't belong, then I'll let you decide where I sit," Keanu replied. "But just know, wherever I sit, I'll still be myself. And I'll still eat." The confidence in his voice didn't match his clothes. It didn't match the role Lance was trying to cast him in. And that unsettled Lance more than he cared to admit. "Fine," Lance snapped. "We'll seat you." He grabbed a menu from the podium with a bit too much force, the laminated edge slapping against the countertop. He didn't even look at Olivia as he passed her, nor did he ask if she wanted to help. Instead, he turned sharply and began walking. Keanu followed, his boots echoing softly on the marble floor. As they passed through the main dining room, heads turned. A few guests chuckled. Others stared openly. One man lowered his wine glass and narrowed his eyes, recognizing the stranger, but unsure from where. Lance led him past the bar, past the glowing centerpiece tables under the chandeliers, and toward the far back corner of the restaurant. The lighting dimmed here. The hum of conversation gave way to the clanging of kitchen plates and the distant roar of the dish station. A table sat next to the swinging kitchen doors, half-shadowed, forgotten. The seat wobbled slightly. The silverware was one set short. Lance gestured toward it like it was a gift. "Here you go," he said, voice dripping with mockery. "The perfect table, private, quiet. I'm sure you'll find it memorable." Keanu looked at the chair, then at Lance. He smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just knowingly. "I think I will." Then he sat down, and across the room, Olivia turned away from the host stand, a strange tightness growing in her chest. Because something about this wasn't over. Something about this was just beginning. The clatter of plates from the kitchen echoed faintly behind him, but Keanu sat still, completely at ease in the dim, awkward corner of the restaurant. He folded his hands loosely in his lap, glancing once at the menu Lance had slapped down with theatrical disdain, but he hadn't opened it yet. He was just waiting. Lance stood nearby, arms crossed, hovering by the wine station as if guarding the perimeter. His eyes darted back to Keanu every few seconds. He was expecting something. A flinch? A look of discomfort? A surrender? But Keanu remained composed, expression unreadable. Lance clicked his tongue in irritation. The man should have left by now. That table was where they sent walk-ins who couldn't take a hint. Most people got the message immediately. But not this guy. Not Hoodie Boy. He walked back toward the host stand, trying to shake the growing unease in his gut. Olivia was still there, standing quietly beside the reservation tablet. She didn't look at him, but he knew she'd seen everything. Lance leaned closer to her and whispered, "So what's the deal with this guy? Is he someone you know or just another charity case?" Olivia didn't answer right away. She kept her eyes on the screen. "His reservation's real," she said softly. Lance scoffed. "Yeah, and I'm the Prince of Monaco." Olivia finally looked at him, her brows furrowed. "I think you're making a mistake." "Oh, do you?" Lance replied, loud enough for a couple of nearby diners to glance over. "Thanks for the tip, intern. I'll keep that in mind." Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She turned away. He was enjoying this. The way she backed down, the way the room had resumed its usual hum of laughter and muted conversation. As far as he was concerned, balance had been restored. But something still gnawed at him. Keanu hadn't left. And worse, he hadn't reacted at all. Lance grabbed a crystal water pitcher from the back bar and began filling glasses at nearby tables. As he worked, he made a show of smiling broadly, nodding graciously to the regulars. A Hollywood producer here, a tech billionaire there, people who belonged. He didn't notice Olivia glance one more time toward the corner where Keanu sat. And he certainly didn't notice the man at table 6 slowly lower his wine glass and shift slightly in his seat. Eyes locked not on the food, but on the quiet stranger by the kitchen doors. Lance returned to the host stand with a little extra swagger in his step. The moment he set the pitcher down, Olivia spoke up again, this time more firmly. Eamon complained. "Not once." Lance raised an eyebrow. "Is that supposed to impress me?" "He was polite," she continued, "even when you insulted him, even when you gave him the worst table in the house." Lance leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. "Listen to me. This place runs on perception. You think people come here because the food's revolutionary? No. They come because we tell them who matters. And if that guy thinks walking in here wearing a hoodie is going to win him respect, he's dead wrong." Olivia didn't answer. Her jaw was tight. Lance snorted. "Don't feel sorry for him. He'll be gone soon enough. Guys like that don't last past the appetizer." But even as he said it, something tugged at him. That unwavering calm. That silent confidence. It didn't fit the mold. People usually folded under this kind of treatment. They apologized, stammered, made excuses, or just walked out. Keanu did none of those things. And that's what bothered Lance most of all. He turned back toward the dining area and froze. Keanu hadn't touched the menu. Instead, he was helping a nearby server pick up a tray of glasses that had tumbled near the kitchen doors. He moved without hesitation, kneeling to retrieve each piece as if it were second nature. The server, a young man named Jalen, looked stunned. Lance's stomach twisted. The diners at adjacent tables were watching again. One woman whispered to her husband, "Isn't that—" He didn't catch the rest. Keanu stood, nodded politely to Jalen, then returned to his seat. Still calm, still quiet, still not rattled. Lance walked briskly back to the host stand, pretending he hadn't seen any of it. But Olivia was looking at him now with something different in her eyes. "You still think he's nobody?" she asked quietly. Lance didn't respond. Instead, he opened the reservation system again and began furiously typing. Then he muttered under his breath, "I'll find a way to get him out." And for the first time, Olivia felt the weight of something deeper. This wasn't just pride anymore. This was fear. Lance tapped aggressively at the reservation tablet, pretending to search for a technical glitch that didn't exist. Every second Keanu remained seated, chipped away at his control. The balance of Lexkis was delicate. Perfection balanced on perception. And now that perception had a crack in it, sitting quietly at table 16 in worn jeans and a hoodie. "Henry," he clicked into the reservation log, scanning for a reason, any reason, to nullify the booking. There wasn't one. Confirmed. Table assigned. Timestamp accurate. He cursed under his breath. Just then, Olivia stepped away from the stand and started walking toward Keanu. Lance turned sharply. "Where do you think you're going?" She stopped, startled. "I was just going to check if he needed anything," she said. "He's been sitting there almost 20 minutes, and no one's taken his order." "I'll handle it," Lance snapped. "We don't need you fawning over him." "I wasn't," she began. "You were," he interrupted. "You want to help him? Fine. You can help by not making things worse." Olivia looked like she wanted to say more, but she didn't. She turned and stepped back behind the stand, lips pressed into a thin line. Lance took a breath, smoothed his vest, and walked back toward Keanu's table with forced ease. This time, his face wore a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Keanu looked up from his seat, a quiet stillness in his posture that seemed to unsettle everyone who got too close. His eyes tracked Lance without a hint of fear or frustration. "Still waiting," Lance said with a feigned laugh. "Apologies, we've been quite busy." Keanu gave a small nod. "No rush." Lance leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a tone that mimicked concern. "I just want to be honest with you. This is a place where people come to impress, to celebrate, to be seen. You seem like someone who appreciates privacy." "I do," Keanu said. "And comfort," Lance added. "Also true." Lance gestured toward the entrance. "There's a diner 3 blocks away. Cozy booths, no dress code. You might find it more appropriate." Keanu's gaze didn't waver. "I've eaten there before. Good pancakes." Lance blinked. "But tonight," Keanu continued, "I'm in the mood for truffle risotto." Lance chuckled dryly. "That's a $3 sign item, just so you're aware." "I am?" Keanu said. Lance leaned in a bit more. "Look, I'm going to be real with you. Our regulars, they notice things. When someone doesn't fit the room, it changes the mood. We're booked up tonight, packed. Maybe you let us cancel the reservation. No harm done." Keanu studied him for a long moment. The pause stretched, and for a second Lance felt his breath catch. Then Keanu said, "Cancel it if you must, but know that you're not protecting the restaurant. You're protecting your opinion." Lance's lips tightened. Before he could respond, a voice from across the room cut through the tension. "Excuse me," a man said. Both turned to see an older gentleman seated at table 6. White hair, dark blue suit, a heavy gold ring on his left hand. His name was Charles Benton, one of the restaurant's most loyal patrons. "I'd like to buy that man a glass of wine," Charles said. "Whatever he prefers?" Lance's jaw clenched. Keanu turned to Charles and nodded politely. "Thank you, I appreciate the gesture, but I'm fine with water." Lance spun on his heel and walked quickly back toward the front, every step more rigid than the last. Eyes were on him now. He felt them, watching, judging, measuring. His grip tightened on the order pad. He'd underestimated Keanu. And now the room was starting to shift. It wasn't going to be as easy to control as he thought. Not anymore. Lance returned from the front with his jaw tight and his chest full of heat. The comment from Charles Benton still echoed in his ears, and the way Keanu had calmly declined the wine offer without fanfare, only added insult to injury. The worst part was the silence. No raised voices, no argument, just Keanu's infuriating calm. He needed to end this, not just seat the man, put him in his place. Lance glanced around the room, scanning for the most inconvenient, unflattering spot he could find. He saw it immediately. Table 22, near the swinging kitchen doors. Next to the corridor that led to the restrooms, a space barely lit where the polished glow of the chandeliers faded into industrial shadows. That table was never used unless absolutely necessary. The kind of table you gave someone when you wanted them to leave before dessert. He didn't announce his plan. He didn't consult Olivia. He simply marched back toward Keanu's table, plastering on a fake smile. "Right this way," he said. Keanu stood without hesitation. No questions, no raised brow. He followed. As they weaved through the tables, heads turned. Conversation slowed. The scent of seared duck and citrus reduction mixed with murmurs of curiosity. Toward the center of the room sat a sharply dressed couple, Graham and Lorraine Caldwell. He wore a navy blue designer suit with a silver pocket square. She was draped in emerald silk, her diamonds catching the light with every subtle turn of her wrist. Lorraine raised an eyebrow as Keanu passed. "Now, that's interesting," she whispered. Graham smirked. "Looks like someone wandered in from a bus stop." They both chuckled quietly. Keanu heard them. He didn't stop. His eyes didn't even flicker in their direction. Lance, however, caught every word and let it feed the fire inside him. He reached table 22 and made a show of presenting it. "Here we are," he said. "Cozy, right?" The clatter of pots and pans rang out behind the double doors as a chef shouted an order. The light overhead buzzed faintly, casting a yellow hue on the scratched tabletop. A faint smell of bleach lingered in the air. Keanu glanced around. Then, to Lance's surprise, he smiled. "This'll do just fine," he said. Lance blinked. "You're sure?" Keanu pulled out the chair himself and sat down with complete ease. "I'm comfortable," he replied. "Thank you." Lance stood there a moment longer, waiting for Keanu to complain. Most people would have. That table was the unspoken punishment for guests who didn't meet the invisible standards. It was loud, poorly lit, constantly disrupted by foot traffic and clanging trays. But Keanu didn't even shift in his chair. He reached for the menu and opened it slowly, as if he had all the time in the world. Lance's smug confidence faltered for half a second before he recovered. "Enjoy your dinner," he said with thin sarcasm. "Let me know if the ambience is too much." Keanu looked up from the menu. "I've eaten in louder places," he said softly. Lance didn't respond. He turned and walked away, forcing himself not to glance over his shoulder. He wanted this man to feel invisible. He wanted him to feel small. But nothing about Keanu's energy felt small. From her place at the host's stand, Olivia watched the whole exchange unfold. Her stomach turned as Lance strutted back across the floor like he had won something. She could still see Keanu, now backlit by the swinging doors of the kitchen. A server rushed past him with 3 plates balanced on his arm. The doors slammed open and shut every 30 seconds. It was chaos. But Keanu didn't flinch. He just sat there, reading. Graham and Lorraine Caldwell whispered again, their amusement turning into idle speculation. "Maybe he's a stuntman," Graham said with a low chuckle. "Doubt it," Lorraine replied. "Stuntmen don't sit that still. Look at him. No nerves. It's weird." "Maybe he's one of those social experiment YouTubers," Graham suggested, "trying to see how people react to a nobody walking into a place like this." "Or maybe he's just lost," Lorraine said. Either way, it's kind of pathetic. Their table was far enough that Keanu couldn't hear the words, but Olivia could. And so could Charles Benton, still seated with his untouched dessert and half-so glass of Merlot. He watched the couple, then he looked back at Keanu. He wasn't smiling anymore. Lance returned to the host stand and muttered under his breath, "He won't last another 10 minutes." Olivia didn't answer, but something in her chest told her that this night was far from over. And the man they were trying to push out? He wasn't going anywhere. Back at table 22, the noise from the kitchen continued. Metal trays crashing, voices rising in frustration, and the sudden shriek of a dropped pan. The staff inside was in full dinner rush mode, and the narrow space between Keanu's seat and the swinging double doors vibrated with movement. The edge of the table wobbled slightly every time someone brushed past. The lighting overhead flickered once, then steadied into a dull, buzzing glow. Still, Keanu didn't shift. He didn't grimace. He didn't complain. He simply placed the menu down, leaned back slightly, and took a sip of the water Lance had poured earlier. It wasn't even cold anymore. He glanced around the room once, not scanning, not searching, just quietly observing. Every face he saw was turned away, either deliberately ignoring him or openly pretending to forget he existed. Only Olivia, from her place by the host stand, seemed unable to tear her eyes away. She stood stiffly, holding a fresh set of menus, though no one was arriving. Her expression was tight, her hands fidgeting against the leather covers. Back at the center of the dining room, Graham and Lorraine were still snickering behind their wine glasses. They'd called over Lance and were now gesturing with faux curiosity toward Keanu's corner. "So," Graham began in a stage whisper, "who is our guest of honor tonight? That's got to be the worst seat in the entire building." Lance chuckled, straightening his cuffs. "Some guy who booked online. Probably thought this was a buffet. I figured I'd give him a little taste of luxury dining. Real luxury." Lorraine raised a brow. "You gave him that table?" "I did," Lance said. "And he thanked me for it. Can you believe that?" The couple laughed, amused. "What's he doing now?" Lorraine asked, tilting her head. Lance glanced over his shoulder. Keanu had stood up. He wasn't leaving, just stretching slightly, as if trying to ease the tightness in his back. He turned and gently pushed the chair back under the table with one hand. Then he stepped aside, allowing a server with a heavy tray to pass by him with ease. Not once did he interrupt the flow of service. He sat down again and opened the menu once more, fingers brushing over the pages without hurry. Lance turned back to the couple. "Still here, but I give it 5 minutes." "You sure he can even afford the appetizers?" Graham quipped. "Let him see the wine list," Lorraine added. "That'll clear the room." They laughed again. But across the restaurant, Charles Benton hadn't laughed once. He watched Keanu with narrowed eyes, the same way a seasoned investor watched the markets shift, quietly, analytically, sensing something others couldn't. After a long pause, he folded his napkin, placed it neatly beside his plate, and pushed back his chair. He stood and walked slowly toward the bar, giving Lance a long look as he passed. Lance offered him a nervous smile. "Everything okay, Mr. Benton?" Charles didn't answer. He just kept walking, pausing briefly beside Olivia. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded, surprised by the question. Charles looked back toward Keanu, still seated in the far corner, still calm. "That man over there," Charles said. "You watch closely. He doesn't need to raise his voice to be heard." Then he walked away. Olivia remained frozen for a moment, heart pounding, because deep down, she already knew he was right, and she had a growing sense that the worst seat in the house was about to become the most unforgettable one. Lance stood near the espresso machine, arms folded, eyes locked on Keanu from across the room. He watched every movement, each glance at the menu, each time Keanu calmly shifted his chair to let a server pass. The man's patience wasn't just unsettling anymore, it was infuriating. Most guests would have complained by now, demanded to be reseated, asked for a manager, but not him. He didn't ask for anything. He just existed comfortably where he wasn't supposed to be. And that, to Lance, was a challenge he couldn't ignore. He snatched a crystal pitcher of water from the counter and grabbed a tall glass with it, balancing them both as he began to make his way toward table 22. He didn't move quickly. No, this had to look deliberate, polished. He was just a server, attending to a guest. But as he approached the table, he adjusted his grip on the pitcher ever so slightly, just enough to tilt it an extra inch. Keanu looked up as Lance neared. "Would you like some water while you decide?" Lance asked with a wide, artificial smile. Keanu nodded. "That would be nice, thank you." The moment the words left his mouth, Lance tipped the pitcher, too fast, too far. A cascade of ice-cold water surged over the edge and splashed directly into Keanu's lap. It drenched the front of his jeans and splattered onto the floor. The sound was sharp, like a burst balloon, followed by the distinct clink of falling ice. Gasps came from nearby tables. A woman across the aisle let out a surprised, "Oh! Oh!" A waiter rushing past froze mid-step. Olivia, who had been placing menus on a side podium, turned at the sound and stared in horror. Lance straightened, feigning surprise, holding the pitcher slightly away from his body, as if it had betrayed him. "Oh my," he said, voice laced with false concern. "I'm terribly sorry." Keanu looked down at his lap, then back up at Lance. There was no anger in his expression, no embarrassment. He simply picked up the folded napkin from the table and dabbed gently at the soaked fabric, his movements slow, controlled. "It's all right," Keanu said. "Accidents happen." Blanche blinked. He hadn't expected that. The way Keanu said it, quietly, without sarcasm, without bitterness, made it land even harder than a shouted insult. Guests from nearby tables had stopped eating. They were watching, not just the scene, but how it was handled. Lance cleared his throat, trying to reclaim the upper hand. "I can bring you another napkin," he offered. Keanu looked at him for a long moment. His eyes were steady, calm. "That's thoughtful," he said, "but no need. I'll dry off." He returned to his menu like nothing had happened, and Lance stood there for a second too long, pitcher still in hand, before turning on his heel and walking away. His jaw clenched tighter with every step. Lance moved quickly through the dining room, avoiding eye contact. He reached the server's station and set the pitcher down a little too hard, the clang of crystal hitting granite louder than it needed to be. His fingers twitched. His face was hot. The smirk he wore earlier was gone, replaced by a flush of embarrassment he couldn't quite explain. It hadn't worked. The spill, the setup, it should have been enough to make any normal guest bolt. Keanu had every reason to be humiliated, to storm out in frustration, soaked and furious. That was the point. That was the game. But instead, he sat there, cool, steady, still flipping through the menu like nothing happened. Lance muttered under his breath, then looked up to find Olivia watching him from across the room. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes said enough. She had seen the whole thing, and for the first time she wasn't just disappointed. She was suspicious. She stepped toward the station slowly, her hands behind her back. "You okay?" she asked. "Perfectly fine," Lance replied without looking at her. "You sure?" she said. "Because I've poured water at that table a dozen times. I've never missed." Lance turned to her, his smile forced. "Then maybe you should teach me your technique." Olivia stared at him a moment longer, then walked away. Back at table 16, Graham and Lorraine Caldwell were still enjoying the scene far more than their appetizers. "Did you see that?" Graham whispered. Lorraine nodded, lifting her wine. "Full-on splash zone, and he didn't even flinch." "He's either insane," Graham said, "or he's someone." Lorraine tilted her head. "I can't figure him out. The way he looked at the waiter afterward, it wasn't anger. It was like he pitied him." Across the room, Keanu folded his napkin and set it beside the water glass. His jeans were visibly damp, The fabric darkened across his thighs. But he didn't shift uncomfortably. He didn't request help. He didn't call for the manager. He just sat there, peaceful. A few tables over, Charles Benton was watching again. He hadn't touched his wine since the spill. His fork rested untouched on the edge of his plate. He leaned back slightly and looked around the room. He could feel it. Something had shifted. Something deeper than spilled water and harsh whispers. There was more to this man than any of them knew. And Charles had the growing sense that tonight was not going to be just another dinner at Lex Squeeze. Lance tried to reset himself behind the espresso station, straightening napkins that didn't need straightening, polishing silverware that was already spotless. But his ears were still ringing. Not from noise, but from the silence that had followed the spill. That silence had said more than any gasp. It wasn't shock, it was judgment. And it wasn't aimed at Keanu. It was aimed at him. He stole another glance at Keanu's table. Still seated. Still calm. Still unmoved. The napkin he'd used to blot his jeans now rested folded beside his water glass. He wasn't hiding the mess. He wasn't trying to make anyone feel sorry for him. He wasn't reacting at all. And somehow, that made Lance feel smaller than if the man had stood up and screamed. He needed to take control again. He couldn't let this linger. So he headed back toward the table with a forced air of politeness and a folded clean napkin in hand. When he arrived, Keanu looked up with that same unreadable expression. "Fresh napkin," Lance offered. "On the house." Keanu gave a soft nod. "Thank you." Lance hesitated. Something in Keanu's eyes, still steady, still watching, made his palms feel clammy. "Again, sorry about earlier," he said. "Busy hands, slippery pitcher." Keanu looked at him for a long moment before replying. "I believe in second chances," he said. "Just not always for first impressions." The words landed softly, but deeply. Lance opened his mouth, searching for a clever reply, but nothing came. He turned and left without another word. At the host stand, Olivia watched him approach. She had heard every word. Lance avoided her gaze and pretended to check the reservation list. "He's not going to order anything," Lance muttered. "He's just sitting there to make a point." "Or maybe," Olivia said carefully, "he's just waiting for a little kindness." Lance didn't answer. He couldn't, because deep down, something about that man at table 22 had gotten under his skin. It wasn't just the clothes or the quiet voice, or the way he'd taken every insult like it was wind against a stone. It was the way he made everyone else feel exposed. The way Charles Benton watched from across the room, eyes sharp and quiet. The way even Graham and Lorraine, who loved to mock everyone beneath them, had started to shift in their seats. And most of all, the way Olivia no longer looked nervous around Lance. She looked disappointed. Lance clenched his jaw and looked over his shoulder one more time at table 22. Still there, still calm, and now Lance realized he wasn't the one observing the room anymore. He was being observed, and he had no idea who exactly he had just humiliated, but he was about to find out. Lance stood still behind the host stand for nearly a full minute before he moved again. The thin veil of control he'd built around himself was beginning to crack, and worst of all, the man in the hoodie didn't seem to be doing anything except existing, sitting quietly, making no scene, making no demands. Yet somehow his presence had turned the dining room into a stage, and every other person, Lance included, was playing a part they didn't understand. He needed to re-establish control. He picked up a menu and turned toward table 22. As he walked past Charles Benton's table, he caught the older man's gaze. A silent look passed between them, one that Lance couldn't decipher. Charles gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, then went back to slowly stirring his wine. Lance continued toward Keanu's table. The man was still seated in the same calm, upright posture. His lap had mostly dried, though the dark patches on his jeans remained. He closed the menu gently and looked up with the same relaxed focus that had unnerved Lance from the beginning. "I see you've had a chance to look over the options," Lance said, placing the second menu on the table anyway, "but I thought I'd point out a few of our standout selections." Keanu nodded politely. "Go ahead." Lance opened the menu theatrically, pages rustling with unnecessary flair. "Well," he began, "if you're feeling adventurous, we have our garden salad, $18, comes with house-made vinaigrette." Keanu blinked, but said nothing. "Or," Lance continued with a chuckle, "you could try the lobster bisque, although that might be a little rich." He let the words hang in the air. Still, Keanu remained quiet. Lance turned the page with mock ceremony. And here we are, our most distinguished item. The Imperial Truffle Tasting. Imported white truffles, Wagyu medallions, and saffron risotto. A true experience. $425. He looked up, expecting to see discomfort. Instead, he saw curiosity. "What's in the broth?" Keanu asked. That caught Lance off guard. The relative. "The broth?" "Yes," Keanu said, pointing. "It's listed under the truffle tasting. Says, aromatic broth. What's in it?" Lance hesitated, then stammered, I believe it's a reduction with veal stock, shallots, and mushroom extract." Keanu gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Sounds good." Lance blinked. "Wait, are you saying you want to order that?" "I am," Keanu replied simply. "I'll have the tasting." A nearby couple paused their conversation to glance over. A spoon froze halfway to someone's mouth. Lance tried to recover with a scoff. "You know that's the most expensive thing on the menu, right?" "Yes," Keanu said calmly. "That's why I asked about the broth." Lance stared at him. Keanu smiled. "I'd like it medium rare." Lance stood frozen for a beat too long. He wasn't sure what rattled him more, the fact that Keanu had ordered the most expensive item on the menu without blinking, or the quiet confidence in the way he'd said it. No bravado, no hesitation, just a simple, direct request, delivered as naturally as asking for a glass of water. Behind them, a nearby table began to whisper. "Did he just say the Imperial Tasting?" a woman asked. Her companion leaned in. "That's $400. And look at what he's wearing." Lance heard it too. The eyes in the room were shifting again. Trying to steady himself, he cleared his throat. "Well," he said tightly, "it does take 45 minutes to prepare. You may want to consider something a bit more accessible." Keanu didn't blink. "I'm not in a rush." Lance forced a laugh. "Some guests are surprised by the price after the fact. Just making sure we're clear." "We are," Keanu said, "but thank you for your concern." Another guest, a businessman seated near the back, lowered his phone, now listening. Lance could feel the attention building around them like a pressure cooker. Keanu turned the menu toward Lance. "Unless you'd recommend something else," he added, voice even. It wasn't a challenge, it was an invitation. But it landed like a punch. Lance swallowed and shook his head. "No," he muttered, "that'll be fine." He scribbled the order on his notepad with more force than necessary. Keanu folded his menu again, setting it neatly in the center of the table. He adjusted his silverware slightly, then rested his hands on the table. Calm, collected, utterly undisturbed. Lance turned and walked back toward the front, but his ears were burning. Every step felt heavy. The whispers were multiplying now, not because of anything Keanu had done, but because of everything Lance hadn't. Behind him, Olivia watched the way Keanu's presence had begun to alter the air in the dining room. Not by force, not by fame, but by presence. Like a stone dropped in still water, creating ripples with no effort at all. She walked up behind Lance as he reached the station and set down the order slip. "You're not going to like this," she said softly. "What now?" She hesitated, then nodded subtly toward the corner. "Someone just Googled him." Lance followed her gaze. The woman seated at table 9 was showing her phone to her date. His eyebrows lifted. His eyes widened. They weren't whispering now. They were staring. Lance's stomach dropped. He looked back toward table 22. Keanu had just taken a sip of his water and was now leaning back in his chair, perfectly relaxed, as if he knew exactly what was happening, as if he'd known all along. Lance's breath caught in his throat as he watched the recognition spread. It moved like wildfire. One table murmuring to another, then to another. Soon, half the room was glancing toward table 22, their previous conversations forgotten. A couple in their 50s craned their necks for a better look. A group of young tech investors near the bar paused mid-test, confusion flashing across their faces. Even Graham and Lorraine Caldwell, who had been mocking Keanu just minutes ago, had gone quiet. Lorraine leaned in, whispering to her husband. You think it's him? Graham narrowed his eyes. I'm not sure. It can't be. He wouldn't dress like that. Or maybe, she said. That's exactly why he would. Lance turned to Olivia, voice low but tight. What did they see? What was on the phone? She didn't answer immediately. She looked almost regretful. Then she said, a photo of him, at a fundraiser, same face. Same eye. Lance felt like the floor shifted under him. He shook his head. It still doesn't mean anything. That could be a look-alike. He's not a look-alike, Olivia replied. He's just quiet. Lance grabbed the printed ticket from the kitchen printer, needing to focus on something else. Anything else. The order had already gone in. Imperial truffle tasting, medium rare. No turning back now. But the sound of a single fork dropping at a nearby table drew his eyes again. One of the regulars, someone who had never once looked twice at a guest, was now frozen mid-bite, staring at Keanu with wide eyes. Whatever illusion Lance had been building, it was beginning to unravel. Fast. He made one last-ditch effort. He stepped toward the corner and cleared his throat. Would you like to add anything else to your order? He asked, a little too loud. Keanu looked up. No, he said. This will be enough. Lance tried to recover his smile. It's just, most guests pair the tasting with a bottle. The Chateau Margaux, perhaps? Keanu looked around the room slowly. People were watching, not with mockery anymore, but curiosity, caution, maybe even respect. Then he said, without raising his voice, I think water will do, unless, of course, you believe it's not appropriate for someone like me. Lance didn't answer. He couldn't. Keanu didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He just turned his eyes back to the menu, already finished with the conversation. Lance stood there for another moment before retreating toward the kitchen. But this time, the whispers weren't about Keanu. They were about him. And the more he listened, the more he realized the room was no longer under his control. The man in the hoodie had turned the whole restaurant upside down and hadn't even touched his food. Lance's shoes clicked against the polished floor as he rushed back toward the main station. His nerves were on fire. He tried to walk like everything was fine, shoulders square, pace steady. But something had shifted, not just in the room, in him. He couldn't explain it, but the control he had always wielded so effortlessly felt like it had slipped just beyond his fingers. And that man, sitting calmly, still damp, still patient, was the reason. He needed backup. And just as he reached the bar, backup appeared. The restaurant manager moved through the dining room with the casual confidence of a man who'd spent 20 years managing impossible guests, tight tables, and wealthy egos. Douglas was in his early 50s, with neatly parted silver hair, an expensive watch, and a voice that rarely rose above a quiet murmur. He wasn't just the manager, he was the institution. Lance practically intercepted him. Doug, he said, lowering his voice, we've got a situation. Douglas raised an eyebrow but didn't break his stride. Someone choking on a scallop? No, Lance said. Worse. He glanced toward the back corner of the restaurant. Douglas followed his gaze. What am I looking at? He asked. Table 22, Lance whispered. Walk in. No dress code. Hoodie, jeans. I mean, come on. He's sitting in the kitchen's exhaust zone. Douglas turned his head just enough to spot Keanu. At first, his expression didn't change. Then his eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Lance leaned in, smirking. We're calling him the Zen homeless guy. I gave him the worst table and he thanked me. Douglas looked back at him. You gave him that table? Of course I did, Lance said. What else was I supposed to do? Let him sit next to a donor or an investor? Douglas chuckled, but it was short. The kind of laugh that's more about saving face than agreement. You checked the reservation? Douglas asked. Hell said he had one, Lance replied. Some name like Reeves. Olivia confirmed it, but honestly, I think she's just trying to be nice. Could have been a no-show that got auto-fiddled. Douglas glanced again toward table 22. People was sitting still, not doing anything to draw attention, not even looking their way. I'm not saying we kick him out, Lance added, but maybe have security keep an eye on him, just in case. Douglas didn't respond right away. Then, in a voice just barely above a whisper, he said, Let's not stir anything. The last thing we need is a TikTok scandal because we threw out a guy in a hoodie. Lance rolled his eyes. So we just let him camp out in the back of the room like it's a soup kitchen? Douglas gave him a look. Don't exaggerate. He's wearing duct-taped boots, Lance hissed. Douglas didn't reply. Instead, he walked on. Lance stood frozen for a few seconds, frustrated by the non-answer. He had expected Douglas to take control, to put an end to the circus unfolding at table 22. Instead, the manager had walked away, leaving Lance to deal with the mess himself. He turned and spotted Olivia polishing wine glasses near the entry arch. He stormed over to her with clipped footsteps. What did you tell him? Lance asked. Olivia set the glass down. Tell who? Douglas, Lance snapped. You talked to him, didn't you? I didn't have to, she said, keeping her tone even. He could see what's happening with his own eyes. Then why isn't he doing anything? Lance demanded. Maybe because there's nothing wrong with a man in a hoodie ordering dinner, Olivia replied. You're the only one trying to turn it into a scandal. Lance leaned in, voice low. You're new here, Olivia. Let me give you some advice. Places like this don't just serve food. They sell image. That man doesn't match the image. Olivia didn't back down. And yet, the image is starting to revolve around him, isn't it? Lance flinched. Her words weren't sharp, they weren't sarcastic, but they cut deep. He took a step back, forcing a smile that didn't belong on his face. You're in over your head, he said, voice tight. Just do your job and let the professionals manage the guests. I am doing my job, she said, which includes protecting guests from being humiliated. Lance opened his mouth, but before he could respond, a voice cut through the tension. Everything okay here? It was Douglas. He had returned quietly, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Lance straightened immediately. Yes, sir. Just clarifying procedure with the hostess. Douglas looked from Lance to Olivia. Olivia stood firm, shoulders squared. We're fine, she said, her voice calm. Douglas held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he turned to Lance. Take care of your tables. Yes, sir, Lance said, jaw locked. And no more jokes about soup kitchens, Douglas added under his breath. We're not in a country club dining hall, understand? Lance's face reddened. Understood. Douglas walked off again, more briskly this time. Olivia remained still for a moment. Then she quietly went back to folding linens. Lance turned away, but not before casting another glance toward Keanu. He was still seated, still alone, and worse than anything, he had heard every word. The table wasn't that far away, and the restaurant's soft acoustics didn't shield whispered arrogance. Keanu hadn't reacted. But Lance knew he had heard, and that realization sat heavy in his chest more than any reprimand from Douglas ever could. Douglas disappeared down the hallway toward the wine cellar, leaving the floor to resume its polished rhythm, the soft clink of cutlery, the murmur of conversations, the faint strains of a piano track returning the room to its curated calm. But under that calm was a tension that Lance could feel pressing against his chest. He busied himself by refilling water glasses at tables near the center of the room. His smile was painted on, his laugh a little too sharp. He thought if he looked busy enough, no one would notice how rattled he felt. But each time he straightened, his eyes pulled back to the corner. Keanu was still there. His posture was relaxed, one hand resting lightly on the menu. He wasn't staring down the staff, he wasn't glaring at the guests, but something about his quiet composure made it feel as though he saw everything. Every whispered remark, every sideways glance, every false smile. And the silence of it all was worse than confrontation. Olivia, stacking wine glasses behind the host stand, stole another look at him. She caught the faintest smile on his face, not mocking, not smug, just knowing. And for the first time that evening, she wondered if he was letting all of this play out on purpose, as though he was waiting for the right moment to turn the room inside out. Lance slammed a water pitcher down a little too hard, startling a guest at table 14. He apologized quickly, but his nerves were unraveling. This was supposed to be simple. Dismiss the man, discourage him, make him leave. But nothing worked. Every slight only deepened the impression that Lance was the one losing control. From table 6, Charles Benton lifted his glass and studied the scene with careful patience. He had lived long enough, dined in enough exclusive places, to know the difference between wealth and power. Wealth bought the table. Power made the table irrelevant. And the man in the hoodie, quiet, soaked, and insulted, carried the second kind. Douglas's silence had confirmed it. The hierarchy wasn't about to challenge Lance openly, not yet. But they weren't protecting him either. They were waiting to see which way the scales tipped. And slowly, one steady breath at a time, the stranger in the corner was tipping them. By the time Lance returned to the server station, the truth gnawed at him. He wasn't winning. He wasn't even holding ground. He was being watched. And for the first time in years, he felt the sting of being judged by his own stage. The dining room had returned to its curated hum, but tension still lingered like static in the air. Waiters moved in rehearsed precision, glasses chimed gently, and the glow of chandeliers washed the room in gold. Yet even within that glow, the corner where Keanu sat felt different, like a quiet center around which everything else revolved. Keanu placed his napkin neatly beside his water glass and rose from his seat. He didn't move with urgency, nor with the discomfort that Lance had tried so hard to provoke. Instead, he moved with the calm steadiness of someone who owned his place in any room. Without a word, he walked past the swinging kitchen doors and toward the tall windows overlooking the street. The heavy curtains framed the glass, but the view was clear. Outside, a black van pulled up to the curb. Its engine hummed for a moment before cutting off. The side door slid open, and a handful of people began to step out, dressed plainly, without the tailored edges or sparkling gowns that defined the guests inside like skis. They looked uncertain, as if they weren't sure they belonged here. But there was something intentional about their arrival. They weren't wandering. They had been invited. Keanu's gaze lingered on them, expression unreadable. He placed his hands loosely behind his back, watching silently. From the host stand, Olivia noticed his movement. At first, she hesitated. She had spent the entire evening biting her tongue, standing on the sidelines while Lance insulted him, mocked him, and treated him like an intruder. But something about the way Keanu stood at the window, calm, unshaken, almost expectant, drew her forward. She approached cautiously, glancing over her shoulder to make sure Lance was distracted. He was at the far side of the room, trying to charm Graham and Lorraine Caldwell. They laughed too loudly at his forced jokes, but their eyes still flicked occasionally toward the corner. Toward Keanu. Olivia stopped a step away from him. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," she said softly. Keanu turned his head slightly, his expression warm but composed. "For what?" "For how you've been treated tonight," she whispered. "You booked a reservation. You followed the rules. And yet, you've been insulted since the moment you walked in." Keanu studied her for a moment, then smiled gently. "Everyone shows who they are when they think no one is watching." Olivia blinked. "I don't understand." "You will," Keanu said. He looked back toward the van. The group outside was gathering near the entrance now, waiting. Then, as if nothing more had been said, he gave Olivia a nod, turned, and walked calmly back to his table in the far corner. He pulled his chair out and sat down again, posture unchanged, as though the insults, the spill, the stares, all of it were no heavier than the clatter of plates from the kitchen. Olivia stood frozen by the window, the weight of his words echoing in her mind. Olivia lingered by the window, her eyes shifting from Keanu back to the van parked outside. The side door had fully opened now, and the group that had emerged was standing close together beneath the dim glow of a streetlight. Their clothes were plain, hoodies, denim jackets, sneakers worn at the soles. One of them, an older man with weathered hands, leaned against a cane. A young woman clutched a second-hand purse tightly to her chest, as if afraid of losing it. A middle-aged couple held hands, speaking quietly, glancing nervously toward the grand entrance of Les Squeeze. They looked so out of place compared to the glittering scene inside, and yet there was a quiet dignity about them, the kind that didn't need chandeliers or polished marble to exist. Olivia frowned. Guests like these didn't come here, ever. Les Squeeze was designed to keep them out. Her heart raced as she pieced together what Keanu might have meant. Was he waiting for them? She turned her head slightly. Across the room, Keanu sat once more in his chair by the kitchen doors, posture steady, as if nothing around him mattered. But his gaze wasn't on his menu anymore. It was angled subtly toward the front entrance, where those new arrivals would soon step inside. Olivia felt a chill. Whatever was about to happen tonight, it was bigger than spilled water and cheap insults. And Keanu wasn't just enduring it, he was orchestrating something. Something deliberate. "Everything all right?" a voice snapped her out of her thoughts. She flinched, turning to see Lance striding toward her, his smile tight. He glanced past her at the van outside and let out a scoff. Wonderful. More charity cases loitering on the sidewalk. Olivia's jaw tightened. "They're just standing there." "Exactly," Lance said. "Standing there, staring at a place they can't afford. It happens every night. Best thing to do is ignore them." Olivia wanted to speak, to say something sharp, in defense of people she didn't even know, but Douglas's warning echoed in her mind. Stay out of it. She pressed her lips together instead. Lance leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You know what ruins a restaurant like this? Letting people think anyone can just walk in off the street. It destroys the illusion." Olivia stared at him, her frustration mounting. She thought of Keanu's words. Everyone shows who they are when they think no one is watching. Lance had shown exactly who he was. Again and again. And Douglas had chosen silence over correction. The hierarchy here wasn't built on fairness. It was built on protecting the comfortable. But Keanu wasn't shaken. He wasn't angry. He was waiting. Olivia glanced once more toward the van. The group was starting to move now, gathering themselves as they prepared to enter. And suddenly, she understood. The real show hadn't even started. The glass doors at the front of the restaurant eased open with a low hiss. The group from the van stepped hesitantly into the glow of the chandeliers. Their presence was immediate. undeniable. Every polished head in the dining room turned to look. The rustle of designer fabric stilled, forks hovered midway to mouths. The air felt charged, as if the restaurant itself was holding its breath. Lance straightened at the host's stand, his lips curling into a smirk he couldn't quite hide. "Here we go," he muttered, loud enough for Olivia to hear. "The circus just pulled into town." Olivia didn't respond. Her eyes darted past him to the far corner where Keanu sat. He hadn't moved. He hadn't blinked. His gaze was fixed on the newcomers with a calmness that felt almost prophetic, like he had known all along they would arrive. The first to step forward was the older man with the cane. He looked around uncertainly, his eyes squinting against the brilliance of the chandeliers. Behind him, the young woman clutched her purse tighter, shrinking from the sharp gazes directed her way. A low murmur rolled through the room, judgment disguised as curiosity. Douglas appeared suddenly, emerging from the side hall with his usual measured stride. His eyes flicked to Lance, then to the group, then quickly away. His face betrayed nothing, but his silence carried the weight of permission. He wasn't going to stop this. He wasn't going to interfere. And Keanu had heard every word Lance had whispered before. He knew where Douglas stood. He knew who would act and who wouldn't. The group hesitated near the host stand. Olivia instinctively took a half step forward, but Lance blocked her with one arm, his smile fixed. "Reservation?" he asked the older man, his voice sweet but dripping with condescension. Before the man could answer, Olivia's gaze darted once more to the corner. Keanu was watching. He leaned back in his chair, one elbow resting on the table, and for a moment their eyes met across the room. His expression hadn't changed, but his presence spoke louder than words. Everyone shows who they are when they think no one is watching. Her heart thudded. She finally understood. And as the group fumbled to explain themselves, the silence of the restaurant swelled. Because the next moment wasn't going to belong to Lance or Douglas or the guests dripping in jewels. It was going to belong to the man in the hoodie. The doors of Lexski's opened wider, and the group from outside stepped into the full glow of the chandeliers. Not 2 or 3, but 10 people in total. They didn't look like the patrons who usually filled the restaurant's leather chairs and crystal-lit tables. Their clothes were plain, their movements hesitant, and their eyes wide with uncertainty. A man in oil-stained coveralls walked beside a woman in scrubs, her hair still tied in the messy bun of a long hospital shift. Behind them came 2 teachers, their clothes simple and neat, carrying the quiet posture of people who had spent their day in classrooms. At the back of the group shuffled a homeless veteran. His jacket patched, his boots worn through at the soles. He clutched his cap in his hands, eyes darting nervously at the polished marble floor and the wealthy stares that rained down on him. The dining room shifted. Conversations cut short. Silverware hovered. Whispers rippled like wind through tall grass. Lance stiffened at the host stand, his smirk faltering into a look of near panic. This wasn't 1 or 2 stragglers he could dismiss with a wave of the hand. This was a crowd, and the eyes of the room were already locked on them. Douglas appeared instantly, his pace brisk, his voice pitched low but sharp. "What is this?" he demanded, fixing his gaze on Lance as if to demand an answer. Lance stammered, I don't know, they just..." But before he could finish, a chair scraped gently against the floor in the far corner. Keanu stood. He didn't rush, he didn't wave. He simply walked forward, each step steady, eyes fixed on the group of newcomers. And when he reached them, he did something that left the entire dining room stunned into silence. He opened his arms. The first to move was the nurse in scrubs. Her face softened as Keanu pulled her into a warm embrace. Then came the mechanic, his hands still rough with grease, his voice cracking with gratitude as Keanu hugged him too. The 2 teachers stepped forward next, smiling nervously, but Keanu greeted them with the same warmth, no hesitation. One by one, each of the 10 guests was welcomed as though they belonged here more than anyone else in the room. Even the homeless veteran hesitated only for a moment before Keanu reached out and wrapped him in a steady, unflinching hug. Gasps echoed across the room. Some of the wealthy diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, caught between confusion and curiosity. Olivia, standing just a few feet away, felt her throat tighten. She had seen kindness before, but never like this. Not in a place like L'Exquise, where kindness was usually an afterthought, a garnish on a plate rather than something living, breathing, undeniable. Douglas stepped closer to the host's stand, his face pale, his voice a strained whisper meant for Lance. "You tell me right now, what is going on?" Lance shook his head quickly, eyes darting between Keanu and the group. "I don't know. I swear, I don't know." But Olivia did. At least she was starting to. Because as Keanu finished greeting the last guest, she caught sight of 2 familiar faces among the 10. Faces she had seen before, but never expected to see here. And suddenly, the balance of power in the room was about to tilt in ways none of them could imagine. The woman Olivia recognized stood near the center of the group, tall with an elegant posture that didn't match her modest gray cardigan and worn jeans. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, and she carried no purse, no jewelry, nothing flashy. But her eyes told a different story. Olivia had seen her once at a James Beard Foundation event, seated at a VIP table next to 2 Michelin star chefs. It clicked. Elena Park, the food blogger, the one with a global following known for exposing culinary snobbery and championing authentic food experiences. Her reviews had made restaurants and ruined them. And standing just behind her, chatting quietly with the older woman in scrubs, was a man Olivia had only seen in photos. Daryl Ng, the low-profile philanthropist who secretly funded food banks and culinary scholarships across the country. He was said to dine anonymously, sometimes dressing in second-hand clothes just to observe how staff treated the invisible guests. Olivia's heart pounded. She glanced at Lance, who was still frozen in place. Douglas looked like he'd swallowed a lemon, his lips pressed into a tight, colorless line. The room was shifting again, not with whispers this time, but with sudden silence. Every eye followed Keanu and his group as they slowly made their way to the long table near the windows. And then something remarkable happened. One of the teachers pulled out her phone, not to film, but to show something to Keanu. It was a picture. Olivia couldn't see it clearly, but Keanu's face softened when he looked. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, nodded, and smiled. This wasn't random. This wasn't a scene of pity or publicity. This was intentional. These people were here for him, or rather, with him. Douglas finally stepped forward, his voice sharp but uncertain. "Excuse me, sir, this is a private dining reservation. We weren't informed you'd be bringing guests." Keanu looked up calmly from the end of the long table. "They're not guests. They're the reason I made the reservation." Douglas blinked. "I'm sorry." Keanu stood and addressed the room without raising his voice. "Every one of these people has fed others, lifted others, or been overlooked by the world for far too long. Tonight, they sit where they've always belonged, at the center." A hush fell. Even Lance, arms still folded tightly, didn't speak. Olivia looked at Elena, who offered a warm, approving nod, then at Daryl, who quietly slipped an envelope onto the table beside Keanu's place card. The corner of a check peeked out. Olivia caught the number. 6 figures. No fanfare. Keanu pulled out a chair for the homeless veteran and said, "Let's eat." No one moved to stop him this time. The restaurant had changed, but not because of status. Because of presence. Because of purpose. And as the servers scrambled to reassign tables and polish silverware, Olivia realized the real story wasn't who Keanu was. It was who he chose to elevate. Lance stood frozen, his arms crossed, jaw tight. His eyes scanned the group of plain-looking guests now seated around the long table where Keanu had gathered them. Nurses, a school janitor, a weathered-looking man with a military pin clipped to his shirt, a young woman with burn scars on her hands but eyes bright with gratitude. They didn't fit the usual profile of this exclusive restaurant's clientele, and that made Lance uncomfortable. But what made him furious was that Keanu had put him in this position. Douglas cleared his throat beside him. "Lance," he said, keeping his tone tight, "Mr. Reeves has requested you personally serve his table." Lance's head snapped toward Douglas. "You're serious?" Douglas nodded. "Very." Keanu sat quietly, saying nothing more. He simply looked toward Lance, his gaze calm but unwavering. No sarcasm, no smirk, no threat. Just expectation. Lance hesitated, every part of him wanting to protest, but the power dynamic had shifted. He could feel it. Whispers were rising from the surrounding tables. Someone was filming. A waiter stood off to the side with a notepad, uncertain if he should step in or stay out of it. Olivia watched silently from near the host's stand, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. With a forced exhale, Lance grabbed a pad and pen. His knuckles were white as he approached the table. "All right," he muttered through his teeth. "Let's start with drinks." He pointed his pen at the woman seated beside Keanu. She wore a hospital badge still clipped to her blouse. Her name tag read, "Denise." "Sparkling water, please," she said softly. Lance scribbled without looking at her and moved on to the next guest. "Just a lemonade for me," said the janitor, whose name was Raymond. "Do you even know what's on the menu?" Lance asked under his breath, loud enough for those at the table to hear. The veteran, sitting at the far end, raised a hand. "Sweet tea, if you got it." Lance rolled his eyes. "This isn't a truck stop." The words echoed sharply, drawing a few gasps from the surrounding diners. Someone nearby put down their fork. Olivia stiffened where she stood. Keanu didn't interrupt. He simply observed. When Lance finished taking the drink orders, he turned to Keanu. "And for you, Mr. Generosity?" Keanu didn't blink. "Same wine pairing as the Imperial Truffle. For everyone." Lance stared at him. "For all of them?" Keanu nodded once. That was when murmurs turned into full-on discussion across the restaurant. Some guests whispered about who these people were. Others speculated about whether Keanu was making a statement or just showing off. But a few began to pay closer attention, not to the spectacle, but to the subtle grace Keanu showed. In all of the shots, Keanu showed he wasn't performing, he wasn't posturing, he was honoring, and that unsettled more people than it impressed. Lance returned from the kitchen with trembling hands, carrying a tray of wine glasses more expensive than most of the guests at the table had ever seen. The sommelier usually did this, but Douglas had made it clear Keanu's table would be served exclusively by Lance. The spotlight was firmly fixed on him now, and for once, Lance couldn't joke his way out of it. He began distributing the glasses, careful not to spill. His hand hesitated slightly as he reached the veteran, who was sitting with his back straight, despite the cane beside his chair. Their eyes met. "Thank you," the veteran said plainly. Lance didn't respond, just moved on. The next guest, a mechanic in oil-stained jeans, chuckled softly as Lance handed her a glass. "Didn't think I'd be getting this kind of service today." "Enjoy it while it lasts," Lance muttered under his breath. More guests at surrounding tables had now turned to watch. Some looked intrigued, others uncomfortable, but none were indifferent. The tension had taken on a life of its own. As the food arrived, delicately plated truffle risotto, shaved mushroom carpaccio, and golden roasted duck, one of the younger guests, a public school teacher named Aaron, leaned toward Lance as he served her plate. "Do you always treat people like this?" she asked kindly, not confrontational, just curious. Lance's jaw twitched. "Only when charity cases pretend they belong here." Aaron's face fell. and she looked down at her plate. That was the final straw. Keanu stood. The clinking of silverware stopped. Conversations ceased. Silence rolled across the dining room like a slow tide. Keanu didn't raise his voice. "I brought them here," he said, his voice steady and clear, "because they've earned it, more than most people here will ever understand." He looked around the room, not just at Lance, but at the bystanders, the staff, the curious onlookers who had remained silent through it all. "I wanted them to feel what it's like to be respected, to be honored, to be seen." Then he sat down again. The silence held for several seconds more. Then someone at the far end of the restaurant quietly clapped. Another joined in, and then a few more. It didn't turn into a standing ovation. It didn't need to. Douglas watched nervously from the edge of the bar, arms crossed tightly. He had misjudged the moment. This wasn't just some eccentric celebrity dinner stunt. The temperature in the room had shifted, and his silence earlier now felt like complicity. Olivia caught his eye and gave a subtle shake of her head. He turned away. Lance stood frozen, holding an empty tray, face pale. He wasn't used to being the one judged. Every sarcastic smirk, every cutting comment, it had all landed in the spotlight now. He cleared his throat and reached for the final dish, a delicate dessert of spun sugar and citrus cream, and placed it in front of the veteran. "Thank you," the veteran repeated, but this time he smiled. Keanu looked around at his guests, his eyes soft. He didn't need to say another word. Class, as it turned out, wasn't about money, or clothes, or who had the most polished shoes. It was about how you treat the person across the table from you, especially when you think no one else is watching. And that night, the whole restaurant had finally learned the difference. One whispered moment at a time, Keanu reached slowly into the inner pocket of his jacket. His fingers brushed something familiar, something he rarely used, something meant only for moments that mattered. He drew out a sleek black card and laid it gently on the tablecloth beside his empty plate. It shimmered slightly under the overhead light. No name, no number, just a small, barely visible emblem in the corner. 2 intersecting silver leaves beneath a crown. Discreet, but unmistakable. Douglas saw it first. He was walking over to check on the table, still unsure how to navigate the uneasy tension that had bloomed around Lance's behavior. But as his eyes landed on the card, he froze, mid-step. His breath caught in his throat. That emblem, he knew it well. Only a few people in the world carried that card. Fewer still ever showed it. Douglas's hands dropped to his sides. His jaw moved, but no sound came out. He blinked, then blinked again. His spine straightened, as if some instinct reminded him to stand at attention. Keanu sat calmly, watching him, not gloating, not smirking, just waiting. Douglas stepped forward slowly. His voice, when it finally emerged, was hoarse. "Sir, I didn't realize." The ripple effect was immediate. Olivia, just a few feet away, narrowed her eyes at the exchange. Her gaze fell on the card. She tilted her head, then slowly stepped closer. When she saw the emblem, she stopped breathing altogether. That emblem belonged to the silent owners. Lex Keys had a carefully guarded list of elite partners, silent co-owners who invested not for profit but to preserve the legacy, the standard, the soul of the restaurant. Their identities were never publicly shared, not even the staff knew. The card was the only sign, and it was rarely, if ever, displayed. Until now, a nearby couple gasped. One of the guests at Keanu's table leaned forward and whispered to another. Lance, still hovering near the corner with the final empty tray in hand, watched the entire exchange, not yet understanding. His brow furrowed. Then Olivia turned to him, her voice quiet but sharp. "Hell owns this place," she said. Lance blinked. "What?" "Keanu is one of the silent owners," Olivia repeated, her voice trembling. That card? Only partners carry it. The elite, the ones who helped build this restaurant from nothing. Lance let out a short laugh, but it cracked halfway. He looked at Keanu, then at the card, then back at Keanu again. His mouth opened as if to speak, but nothing came out. His face turned a shade paler. "I thought," he stammered, eyes wide, "you were just some guy." Keanu didn't respond. He simply looked at him, not with anger, not with arrogance, but with the kind of silence that made a man feel smaller just by standing in it. Around the room, conversations had halted. Silverware was set down. Phones were discreetly pulled out. People leaned toward their tables, trying to piece together what they had just witnessed. Douglas stepped closer now, visibly sweating. "Mr. Reeves," he said softly, "please accept my deepest apologies. Had I known—" "You didn't need to know," Keanu said gently. "How people behave when they think no one is watching tells you everything." Douglas swallowed hard. He nodded. His eyes flicked to Lance. Lance tried to gather himself. "I didn't mean anything. It was a misunderstanding," he muttered. "Just jokes. You know how it is with casual guests." One of the guests at Keanu's table, an elderly man with a veteran's cap, spoke softly but clearly. "You weren't joking, son. You were performing." Olivia glanced at the man, then at Keanu, realization dawning like a rising tide. This had all been intentional. Every quiet action, every gentle reply, every moment of silence. Keanu's eyes moved slowly across the dining room, not in judgment, but in awareness. Every guest who had chuckled earlier, every person who had looked down on him moments before, now sat up straighter, suddenly remembering their manners. The silence had weight, as if the room itself realized it had misjudged someone whose shoes it wasn't fit to polish. Keanu finally looked at Lance again. "I asked you to serve my friends," he said quietly. "Not because I wanted to punish you, but because I wanted you to remember something. Dignity has nothing to do with price tags." Lance opened his mouth, but no words came. He stood frozen, his usual smirk gone. His hands trembled as they clutched the edge of the table. One of the guests, a middle-aged teacher in a thrift store cardigan, lifted her glass toward Keanu. "You reminded us of something tonight," she said. "That kindness still counts in this world." The others at the table nodded. The mechanic gave Keanu a subtle thumbs up. The nurse smiled warmly. Even the veteran, whose hands were calloused and worn, offered a salute, so sincere it brought a hush over the nearby tables. Douglas cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Mr. Reeves, would you like to speak with the kitchen? Or arrange anything for your group? I can personally oversee—" Keanu shook his head. "No need to change anything. They already served the best part of the evening." They revealed who they were. He looked over to Olivia, who stood rooted near the host stand, eyes wide. Keanu's gaze softened. "You noticed," he said simply. "When others didn't." Olivia stepped forward, slowly. "I just thought it wasn't right, the way they treated you," she whispered. "Even before I knew who you were." "That's when it matters most," Keanu replied, "when there's nothing to gain." Whispers continued spreading. A few phones buzzed with notifications as word of Keanu's identity and ownership of the restaurant began surfacing on local apps and food blogs. A journalist at the back had already started typing. No cameras had been allowed, but that didn't matter. The story was unfolding, and everyone present knew they'd be talking about this night for a long time. But Keanu didn't care for the spectacle. He turned back to his guests. "Shall we eat?" he said warmly. And just like that, the moment passed, leaving behind silence, awe, and a single, undeniable truth. Class was never about what you wore. It was how you treated people when you thought no one was looking. As the room settled again, the tension giving way to awkward smiles and cautious glances, a quiet shift began at Keanu's table. The man in the plain navy baseball cap, who had remained silent through all the drama, slowly reached up and removed his cap. Gray hair tumbled out beneath it, slightly tousled but unmistakably styled. His face, now fully visible under the dining room lights, triggered a silent ripple through the nearby tables. Olivia blinked, stunned. Her lips parted slightly, and she turned to Douglas. Douglas stared for a moment, his expression frozen in disbelief. The man sitting next to Keanu Reeves, eating truffle risotto on a mismatched chair, surrounded by working-class guests, was not just a guest. He was Jonathan Pryce, one of the most feared and respected restaurant critics in the country, the same man whose anonymous visits had closed down 3 luxury eateries in the past year. The same Jonathan Pryce whose 5-star review could catapult a struggling restaurant into global recognition within 48 hours. The same Jonathan Pryce who famously never revealed his identity during a visit. Until now. Jonathan smiled faintly and placed his cap on the table. "Well," he said with a slow, warm drawl, "I've seen everything, but tonight might just be my favorite meal yet." You could hear a fork drop 3 tables away. Lance froze mid-step, his face draining of color. His lips trembled slightly as he registered what had just happened. The man he'd barely acknowledged, the one he had brushed past with disdain while fawning over influencers and wealthy regulars, had just revealed himself as the most influential voice in the food world. Keanu didn't gloat. He simply nodded in appreciation toward Jonathan, the kind of nod that passed between people who understood each other beyond words. Jonathan continued, his voice calm but deliberate. "The flavors were excellent, the plating decent. The service?" He paused, letting the weight of the moment hang for a second longer. "Inconsistent, arrogant at times, but the story tonight, the human element, that's what set it apart." A soft gasp escaped someone across the room. Another guest at a nearby table reached instinctively for her phone, forgetting for a moment the no-photo policy. Lance took a shaky step back. Douglas glanced at Keanu, then back at Jonathan, panic starting to flicker behind his composed expression. Jonathan Pryce leaned slightly forward in his chair, his fingers gently tapping the edge of his glass. His tone remained measured, but each word landed with unmistakable weight. "I've reviewed restaurants that cost more per plate than some people earn in a week. I've dined in places where service is flawless but soulless. What I witnessed here tonight, though, was something that money can't buy." His gaze swept across the room. Some guests nodded, others looked down, clearly remembering how they had reacted to Keanu's simple presence earlier that evening. He looked at Douglas next, a manager who laughs at cruelty but says nothing. A server who treats people based on their clothes and assumptions. And yet, he turned back to Keanu and Olivia, his voice softening. There was dignity at this table, humanity, the kind of class that can't be taught in hospitality school. Olivia lowered her eyes, unsure whether to cry or beam with pride. Keanu simply gave a small smile, appreciating the moment without claiming it. Jonathan looked directly at Lance now. "I asked for water, you never brought it. I asked a question, you answered with sarcasm. I watched you roll your eyes when Keanu ordered, and I heard what you said to the manager when you thought no one was listening." Lance swallowed hard. His hands were clenched behind his back, his mouth opened, then closed again. There was no excuse that would fit the moment. "Tonight," Jonathan continued, "you failed the simplest test in hospitality, to make people feel welcome." The air turned still. Servers paused. The kitchen staff, sensing the mood shift, peeked from the pass. Even the bartender at the far end of the room stopped polishing glasses. Keanu finally spoke. "People think class is about exclusivity, but the real test of class is how you treat someone who can do nothing for you." Jonathan nodded in agreement. "And from what I saw," he added, "the most generous souls in this restaurant weren't wearing designer suits." His eyes drifted toward the group of guests Keanu had invited. Ordinary people who had been treated as invisible when they walked in. Now, they were being looked at with curiosity and, in some cases, silent shame. Every person at this table, Jonathan said, is worth knowing, worth serving, worth celebrating. Douglas looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Lance's face had turned an angry shade of red, but he said nothing. He knew better now. Jonathan leaned back, letting the silence sit. Not awkward, not uncomfortable, just true. Then he gave a soft laugh. "I have to say, the imperial truffle tasting was decent," he said. "But it wasn't the food that made tonight memorable. It was the lesson." He stood slowly, placing his napkin on the table, and looked once more at Keanu. "You have a rare ability," Jonathan said, "to expose people's hearts without ever raising your voice." Keanu nodded, quietly. "People show you who they are when they think they're above others. I just gave them the space to do it." Lance turned abruptly and walked away, but not before Douglas cleared his throat sharply. "Lance," Douglas called, his voice tense. "You'll stay until the end of service, then we'll talk." Olivia's eyes darted toward Keanu, unsure of how much power he would actually wield now that the truth had surfaced. But Keanu wasn't thinking about control. He was watching the others, his guests, smiling, chatting, feeling human again. Jonathan turned to the rest of the room. "I'll be writing about this evening," he said clearly. "The food, the service, the guests, and the real story underneath it all." He placed his cap back on his head. "And I promise, everyone will read it." Then, without fanfare, he gave Keanu a nod and walked toward the exit. Every eye followed him. The moment he stepped out, a ripple of whispers swept through the dining room. Jonathan Pryce, here, tonight. And they had no idea. But Keanu had known, all along. And that changed everything. Keanu stood slowly from his seat, his palms flat on the table for just a moment, grounding himself. Then, without asking for attention, he walked to the center of the dining room. The clinking of silverware gradually stopped. Conversations faded. Even the waitstaff paused in motion. He didn't need to raise his voice. "I want to tell you all a story," Keanu said softly. "One I haven't told publicly, not really." He scanned the room, eyes lingering not on the wealthy or the critics, but on the servers, the kitchen staff peeking from behind the pass window, and the guests sitting in jeans and modest jackets. "When I was 15, he said, I used to wait outside a diner in Toronto after school. I didn't have enough money to go in most nights, so I'd sit on the curb and watch people come and go, wondering what it felt like to belong." A pause. There was a server there, middle-aged woman, wore orthopedic shoes and always hummed old tunes. One day she brought me a sandwich wrapped in napkins. No receipt, no charge, just a smile. The room remained silent. She didn't ask who I was, didn't care what I wore or how I smelled after school. She just saw a kid who looked hungry and lonely. He let the silence stretch for a moment, letting the weight of memory settle. I never forgot her. His voice grew even quieter, which somehow made people lean in closer. Years later, I returned to that same diner. I was already acting then. I asked about her. She'd retired. I found her living in a small apartment, surviving on barely anything. And do you know what she said when she saw me? He looked directly at Lance now. "You," she said. "I always knew you'd grow into someone kind." Keanu inhaled slowly. It wasn't the movies, or the fame, or the money. It was the way I treated people. Even when I had nothing. He looked across the room again, scanning faces, some ashamed, some stunned, a few nodding slowly. Because the way we treat those we think are beneath us defines who we really are. His eyes returned to Lance and stayed there. And tonight, a few of you revealed exactly that. Lance shifted where he stood, his hands now clasped tightly in front of him. His smirk was gone. Douglas stood a few feet away, frozen in place. as if unsure whether to intervene or disappear. Keanu turned his gaze to the long table where his 10 guests sat. "These people," he said, motioning to them gently, "are not just guests. They are heroes." The woman in the scrubs lowered her eyes. The elderly veteran gave a small nod, his hands folded across his lap. The teacher smiled faintly, her posture upright, as if trying to hold dignity in a place that had denied her that earlier. "They're the people who hold this country together," Keanu said, quietly, without applause, without reservations made weeks in advance. His tone didn't carry bitterness, just quiet truth. Each of them thought they were being invited to lunch. What they didn't know was that they were part of a bigger lesson. He stepped slightly toward Lance again. "When I walked in here, I noticed everything. Not just the ambiance or the wine list, but how people looked at me when they thought I didn't belong." Keanu gestured gently to his hoodie and jeans, now stained with water from a passing bus earlier. "I dress like this often, not because I want to be incognito, but because it shows me what others see when there's no title attached." Lance looked down, his cheeks visibly red now. "There was a time I might have responded with anger," Keanu said. "I might have stood up, called out the arrogance, the cruelty. But that would have made this about me." He turned again to face the full room. "This moment isn't about me. It's about every server who's ever been dismissed, every nurse who's ever been ignored, every teacher who's been spoken over, every veteran who's been treated like they don't matter once they take off their uniform." Someone in the back of the restaurant exhaled loudly, unintentionally breaking the silence. Keanu didn't flinch. "Class," he continued, "is not found in what you wear, or how much your meal costs, or what's printed on your business card." He let the silence settle again. "It's found in how you treat the stranger you think can't give you anything in return." The room stayed hushed, but the mood had shifted. No longer just stunned, it was introspective, convicted. Keanu looked over at Olivia, who stood near the bar, her hands loosely clasped, eyes wide. He gave her a soft, reassuring nod. Then he turned back to the room. "I was 9 years old when a store clerk told my mother I was not the type to try on anything expensive. I remember the way he said it, like it was fact, like there was no chance I could ever rise above what he'd already decided I was." He paused and then let the weight of his next words settle. And in that moment, something changed. I realized, people don't always hurt you with violence. Sometimes they just erase you. A quiet gasp came from somewhere near the center of the room. A woman, dressed in pearls and satin, covered her mouth with her hand. "I promised myself that if I ever had the chance," Keanu said, "I would never let someone else feel invisible when I could help them feel seen." He motioned to the table once again. Today was about making sure these people were seen. The nurse wiped at her eyes. The mechanic gave a small, tight-lipped smile. The homeless veteran, still seated proudly, gave Keanu a slow, steady nod. Keanu walked back toward his seat, stopping just beside Lance. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just said calmly, "The way we treat those we think are beneath us defines who we really are." Lance swallowed hard, staring down at his shoes. Then Keanu turned back to the room once more and smiled, not smugly, but gently, warmly. We all have blind spots. We all forget to look deeper. But moments like these, moments of discomfort, are the ones that offer us the greatest chance to grow. He let the moment hang. "Tonight wasn't a punishment," he said softly. "It was a mirror." And with that, he returned to his table, took his seat, and reached for the glass of water beside his plate. The restaurant remained hushed, as if the walls themselves were still listening. Guests glanced at one another, unsure of what to say, as if words would shatter something sacred that had just been placed in the center of the room. Keanu didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Lance hadn't moved. He stood still, rooted near the dessert station, his hands clenched behind his back. His eyes darted from Keanu to Douglas to Olivia, and then to the guests at the long table. Those same plainly dressed people he had mocked only minutes earlier. No one said a word. The silence was deafening. Keanu rose slowly from his seat. He walked over to where Lance stood, his expression calm, not angry. But there was something unmistakable in his presence, a weight Lance couldn't look away from. "You're probably wondering what happens now," Keanu said gently. Lance gave a weak nod, still unable to meet his eyes. "You think I came here to get you fired or to make some grand public scene?" Keanu shook his head slowly. "But that's not why I brought them, and it's not why I'm still here." Lance looked up, finally meeting Keanu's gaze. His eyes were bloodshot, and behind the usual arrogance, there was something new. Fear. Or perhaps shame. "I don't believe in punishment for its own sake," Keanu said. "It doesn't change hearts, and it certainly doesn't open minds." Douglas shifted awkwardly behind the bar, as if unsure whether to intervene or just listen. Keanu continued. "You made mistakes tonight. You judged, you mocked. You forgot what this place is supposed to represent." He turned, gesturing subtly to the restaurant around them. L'Esquisse was never meant to be a pedestal for the wealthy. It was meant to be a place where excellence and hospitality elevates everyone, regardless of what they wear, where they came from, or what name is printed on their credit card. Lance blinked rapidly, his shoulders stiff. "I'm not firing you," Keanu said clearly. A visible ripple of surprise moved through the room. Even Olivia looked stunned. "But I am offering you a choice." Lance took a shallow breath. Keanu stepped closer, voice lowering just enough for everyone to lean in. "There's a place called The Table. It's not far from here. We built it in a retired church basement. Nothing fancy. No stars, no critics, no wait lists. Just families. Families who've been knocked down. People who don't get noticed when they walk into a room. People who need more than just food." Keanu paused. "I'm asking you to work there. 30 days. No uniform, no salary. Just your hands, your time, and your willingness to see people differently." Lance's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. "You can walk out that door today and never see me again. That's your right," Keanu said gently. "Or you can grow." Lance looked around the restaurant like he was seeing it for the first time. The velvet chairs, the chandeliers, the polished wine glasses, they all suddenly felt heavy. He wasn't standing in a place of pride anymore. He was standing in a mirror. And what he saw made his chest tighten. The guests at Keanu's table hadn't left. In fact, they were still watching him. Not with judgment, but with a quiet kind of expectation. One of the women, a nurse who had spoken earlier, gave him a soft nod. The mechanic next to her leaned back with his arms crossed, eyes unreadable. Jonathan Price, the critic, had set his utensils down and was waiting, not for a review, but for a moment of truth. Douglas stepped forward, confused but supportive. "Lance," he said gently, "I'll respect whatever decision you make, but I think this might be worth listening to." Lance rubbed the back of his neck, the muscles tight. His usual sharp tone was gone. "What is the table exactly?" he asked, voice hoarse. Keanu's answer was immediate. "It's a place where no one asks what you do for a living. No one checks your shoes or your skin. We just serve. Dignity first, questions later." Lance looked at his hands, still trembling from adrenaline. "You want me to volunteer?" "I want you to serve without armor," Keanu said. "No white jacket, no nameplate, no status." "I don't know how to do that," Lance whispered. "That's why it's a challenge," Keanu replied, "not a punishment." A long pause passed between them. Olivia was holding her breath. The kitchen had gone quiet. Even the clinking of plates had stopped, as if the entire building were leaning in. Waiting. Keanu didn't push. He just stood there with an open invitation. "I've worked my whole life for this place," Lance finally said. "I've fought for it. And tonight, I almost ruined it." "You didn't ruin it," Keanu said softly. "You revealed it. Now you have a chance to reshape it, starting with yourself." Lance looked down. His eyes were wet. 30 days. He could walk away, keep his pride intact, and pretend this never happened. Or he could step into a world he'd ignored his whole life. He swallowed hard. "When do I start?" Keanu nodded once. "Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. No uniforms, just you." Lance took a slow breath. "Okay." It wasn't dramatic. No applause followed, no music played, but in that quiet moment, something shifted. Not just in Lance, but in the room. The tension had melted into something unfamiliar yet healing. Jonathan Pryce gave a faint smile and turned back to his plate. Olivia looked at Keanu as if seeing him through new eyes. Douglas stood silently, almost proud. Lance turned to Keanu again. "Why me?" he asked. Keanu's answer was calm. "Because someone once gave me that same choice." Lance absorbed those words, and for the first time all evening, he didn't have a comeback, just a nod. His posture was different now, less guarded, more grounded. Something had broken open, and maybe that was the point. As Keanu returned to his table, Olivia approached Lance. "I'll drive you tomorrow," she said softly, "if you want." Lance looked surprised. "You'd do that?" She nodded. "We all need a first day." Lance looked around the restaurant, his kingdom, and realized it had never really belonged to him. Not until now. Not until he earned it, from the ground up. And for the first time, he was ready to begin. The next morning, the sky was still waking up when Lance arrived at the table. The building looked nothing like the polished marble halls of L'Exquise. There were no valets, no glass chandeliers, no reservation lists. The paint was faded in places, the windows held fingerprints from curious children, and a chalkboard on the front stoop read, "You're welcome here." Lance adjusted his shirt collar, feeling awkwardly overdressed. Olivia had offered him a ride, but he'd declined. He needed to walk, needed to feel the weight of this choice with each step. The door opened before he could knock. A young woman wearing an apron and a big smile greeted him. "You must be Lance," she said warmly. "Welcome to the table." He nodded stiffly. "Yeah, I guess I am." Inside, the kitchen smelled of cinnamon and something earthy, like stew simmering low. It was loud, but not chaotic. A teenage boy stirred a giant pot with practiced ease. A middle-aged man in a marine dad cap wiped down folding tables. A gray-hailed woman chopped carrots with calm efficiency. People wore name tags, not name brands. Their uniforms were laughter, calloused hands, and shared purpose. "Put your stuff down wherever," the young woman told him. "We're just about to open the doors." He hesitated, unsure where his stuff even belonged. Eventually, he found an apron folded on a counter. The name tag read Lance in marker, a little heart drawn beside it. He blinked. "You'll be on drinks," the woman said, handing him a tray of water cups. "Keep them full, offer coffee when you can, no need to rush." Lance had served champagne worth thousands. He had sliced truffles over handcrafted risottos and judged the crispness of duck skin like it was sacred. Now he was standing behind a battered drink station, offering black coffee and paper cups of water. The doors opened. They didn't rush in, they flowed, slowly. A mother with a toddler, a man in a reflective vest, a grandmother holding a cane. Their eyes weren't hungry for food. They were hungry to feel seen. Lance stiffened at first. He nodded curtly, refilled pitchers, kept his gaze low. Then a little girl walked up. She had missing front teeth and carried a crumpled drawing in one hand. She tugged his apron. "Hi, I drew you something." He blinked. "Me?" She smiled. "It's your name. See?" She held up the picture. Colorful crayon letters that spelled Lance, with stars around it, and a tiny stick figure in a blue apron. Something in his chest flickered. He crouched slowly and took the paper in both hands. "Thanks, kid," he said. That's really nice." The little girl's picture found a spot tucked into the pocket of Lance's apron. He didn't want to fold it. He didn't want to smudge the crayon stars. As he stood back up, his eyes caught a woman at one of the tables looking over at him. She had kind eyes and weathered hands. When he brought her a cup of tea, she reached out and gently touched his arm. "You're new here," she said, smiling. "You have the face of someone learning to listen." He didn't know how to respond to that, but her words stuck. Throughout the day, he watched, he listened. He saw volunteers laugh while peeling potatoes, sing along to an old radio, kneel beside guests to speak eye to eye. No one was in a rush. No one was beneath anyone else. It wasn't about pity, it was about dignity. An older man sat near the corner, barely touching his food. Lance brought him a second roll and quietly said, "You doing okay?" The man looked up, startled at first, then he nodded. "Just haven't had anyone ask me that in a while." Lance didn't walk away. He stood there, silent but present. And slowly, he began to see the faces. Not just the need, but the stories. A woman who used to run a bakery before medical bills buried her. A boy who played violin but lost his case in a flood. A veteran who folded napkins with military precision, refusing to eat until everyone else had their tray. By mid-afternoon, Lance wasn't checking the clock. He was checking people's cups. Refilling, smiling, asking names. When a pan clattered to the floor, he rushed to help. He didn't hesitate. At one point, Olivia showed up. She didn't say anything, just smiled as she tied on her own apron. They worked side by side for a while, handing out fruit and wiping tables. He felt her glance at him a few times, curious but not judgmental. "You're different," she said finally in a quiet voice. He shrugged. "I don't know what I am." "Maybe that's the best place to start," she said. Lance didn't argue. He just nodded. At closing time, as chairs were stacked and leftover bread packed into brown paper bags, a soft hush fell over the kitchen. The volunteers gathered for a brief moment of gratitude. No speeches, just a shared silence. One of the teen boys high-fived Lance. "You coming back tomorrow, man?" Lance didn't hesitate this time. "Yeah, I think I am." That night, Lance sat on the edge of his small cot in the volunteer dormitory above the table. The room was simple, plain walls, a creaky fan, and a window that overlooked the alley. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He unfolded the crayon drawing again. The girl had drawn him with a giant smile, arms wide open, surrounded by stars. In the corner, she'd written his name. Lance, with a backwards S. He traced it with his finger and laughed softly. He thought about Keanu. The challenge he had given him hadn't come with lectures or humiliation. It had come with a choice. A mirror. A chance to step into something real. Each face he served today chipped away at the cold armor he'd worn for years. Each small gesture had shown him that class wasn't about price tags or tuxedos. It was about how you made people feel when they stood in front of you. He used to think status protected him. Now he saw how it had blinded him. Tomorrow he'd be back in the kitchen again. Not as a punishment, not to prove anything, but because something inside him wanted to be part of that warmth. He folded the drawing and tucked it into his wallet. Then he turned off the light, rested his head, and let the silence of the night settle over him like a blanket. For once, it didn't feel empty. It felt like the beginning of something better. The door to Lexki's opened slowly. It had been 30 days. Lance didn't stride in like before. He didn't adjust his cufflinks or smooth his designer suit because he wasn't wearing one. Instead, he wore a plain button-up shirt, sleeves rolled, a simple black vest over it, and a pair of worn dress shoes that had seen better days. He carried no clipboard, no air of superiority, just a deep breath that trembled slightly as he exhaled. Heads turned as he entered. The same guests who once flinched under his sharp gaze now looked at him with a mix of curiosity and something else. Something warmer. He paused by the hostess stand, where Olivia stood beside a new trainee. She looked up, and for a moment silence stretched between them. Then Lance spoke first. "I owe you an apology," he said softly, "for how I treated you. For how I treated a lot of people." Olivia blinked, taken aback. The hostess engraving looked between them, confused. "I don't expect forgiveness," Lance continued, "but I needed to say it." Olivia studied him. There was something different about his voice. It wasn't shaky, but it wasn't firm either. It was real, vulnerable. "You really went?" she asked. Lance nodded. "Every day. I worked the line, washed dishes, talked to people I would have ignored 6 weeks ago. It changed everything." Olivia stepped forward. "Then I forgive you." She meant it. Lance's shoulders dropped with visible relief. A small group of guests, waiting for their table, began to clap. It wasn't loud or showy, just a slow ripple of quiet appreciation. Even Olivier's trainee joined in, clearly sensing that something meaningful had just happened. Lance turned, surprised. These were the same people who used to look at him like he was some refined statue, always polished, never flawed. Now they looked at him as something else entirely. Someone human. He made his way through the restaurant, passing each table with a humble nod. No more barking orders, no more smug commentary on posture or perfume. Just a man making peace with his past. Then he saw the table. Table 9, the one no one touched after that night. And sitting at it, exactly where he had been the moment it all changed, was Keanu Reeves. Keanu looked up from a folded napkin in his hands and offered a faint smile. "Have a seat," Keanu said. Lance nodded, still standing for a moment, unsure if he even deserved to sit at that table again. "Go on," Keanu said gently. "You've earned it." Lance sat, not as the maitre d', but as someone different. Keanu studied Lance's face for a few seconds. It wasn't the same man who had once stood at this table, with arrogance in his eyes. This Lance carried something else now. Stillness, humility, and maybe even a little peace. "So," Keanu said, setting down the napkin, "how was your time at the table?" Lance exhaled. "Hard, beautiful, humbling." He looked down at his hands, still faintly marked from hours of scrubbing pots and prepping vegetables. "I met a man named Carl," he continued. "He's 65, used to be a chef at a 5-star hotel until his back gave out. Now he volunteers every morning just to feel useful. And I met Rosa, single mom, 3 jobs, still finds time to serve food to others who need it more than she does." Keanu listened quietly. "There was this little girl," Lance added, his voice softening. "She drew me a picture on my 3rd day. It was just my name tag with a heart next to it. She said it meant I was one of the good ones. I cried in the walk-in fridge after that. Couldn't let the others see." Keanu gave a gentle nod. "Sometimes the coldest places are where we melt the most." Lance smiled weakly. "I used to think status was everything. The right watch, the right voice tone, knowing which fork to use. But it turns out, kindness doesn't care about that, and neither does dignity," Keanu said. They sat in silence for a moment. The clinking of silverware, the soft buzz of conversation, and the occasional burst of laughter filled the space around them. L'Exquise was alive, but this time it felt different to Lance. Less like a temple of prestige and more like a place where people gathered, really gathered, to connect, to enjoy, to belong. "I owe you more than I can say," Lance finally said. Keanu shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. Growth isn't about payment. It's about presence. You showed up." Lance looked around the room. "They're not afraid of me anymore." "No," Keanu replied. "They see you now, not the role. You. There was a quiet pride in Keanu's voice, not boastful, just deeply satisfied that something unseen had shifted, and not just in Lance, but in the ecosystem around him. "I want to keep working," Lance said. "Not just here, but at the table too. Weekends, maybe. I want to stay connected to that world. I don't want to lose what it gave me." Keanu smiled. "Then, that's your next reservation." Lance chuckled, the first genuine laugh he'd let out in a while. The moment Olivia walked out of the kitchen, Lance stood up instinctively. Their eyes met across the room. She approached slowly, her expression unreadable. Before she could say a word, Lance stepped forward and bowed his head. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the way I treated you, for thinking your kindness made you small. You were the one who saw what I couldn't." Olivia didn't respond right away. Then, without warning, she wrapped her arms around him. "You've changed," she whispered. "And that's all I ever hoped for." A few guests nearby clapped softly, touched by the scene. Even the servers smiled, as if a quiet burden had lifted from the room. Lance returned to Keanu's table. "So, what now?" Keanu leaned back in his chair, a knowing look in his eyes. "Now you live what you've learned, every day." As the maître d' of Lexkis once more, Lance moved through the dining room not as a gatekeeper, but as a host with open arms. He greeted an elderly couple in thrift store jackets with the same reverence he once reserved for CEOs. He complimented a shy teen on her prom dress. He shared the origin of a dish with a young man who looked nervous about the menu. Keanu watched it all unfold, then stood quietly. Before leaving, he placed a folded napkin on the table with one final message written inside. "Grace isn't a lesson, it's a lifestyle." And with that, he walked out the door, leaving behind not just a changed restaurant, but a changed man. The restaurant was quiet now. The last clink of silverware had faded. In a corner booth near the window, Keanu sat alone, watching the reflection of the city lights ripple across the glass. The world outside moved fast, but inside, this moment, everything slowed down. His thoughts drifted, not just to the evening's events, but far deeper. He remembered a time when he and his mother had stood in line outside a food pantry, coats too thin for the Canadian winter. He remembered the look in people's eyes as they passed, some curious, some indifferent, and a few, painfully, filled with quiet disdain. The lesson was burned into him early. People don't always see what matters, see the surface, the clothes, the posture, the silence. Keanu folded his hands gently and whispered almost to himself, "We all wear masks, but the truth of a person, it's always in how they treat someone who can do nothing for them." His voice, soft and steady, filled the quiet space. "I've spent years observing people, not with cameras, not with scripts, but with attention. I've watched the way someone opens a door for a stranger, or how they talk to a janitor when no one's looking, the way they glance at someone's shoes before deciding how to greet them, or the way they roll their eyes when someone doesn't speak perfectly. These things reveal more than resumes ever could." He paused, letting the silence breathe. "You see, class isn't stitched into fabric or written on a menu. It's carried in the way you carry others. It's in how you make someone feel when they're vulnerable, when they're invisible, or when they've made mistakes they don't yet know how to fix." Tonight wasn't about a restaurant, or even a man named Lance. Tonight was about the mirror we all face. The uncomfortable moment when we realize we might have been the one looking down our nose, and the powerful moment after, when we decide what to do with that truth. Because what we do next, that's what defines us. There's a story I never told anyone outside my close circle. When I was 19, I was trying to get my foot in the door in Hollywood. I'd scraped together enough money for a suit from a second-hand store. The collar was stiff, the sleeves too short, but I was proud of it. I walked into a studio audition room excited, nervous, hopeful. Before I even reached the front desk, A man walked up to me and asked if I was there to clean the carpets. When I told him I was an actor, he laughed. Not in a cruel way, but in a way that dismissed me like I didn't matter. Like the idea of someone like me being somebody was absurd. I walked out without auditioning. I told myself I wasn't ready. But the truth? I let his judgment define me, if only for a while. It took years for me to realize that judgment is never about the one being judged. It's about the person doing the judging. Their fear, their insecurity, their failure to see clearly. That moment, painful as it was, shaped how I carry myself today. Because the moment you forget where you came from is the moment you stop growing. That's why I started The Table. Not as a charity, not as a handout, but as a place where people could sit down and feel human again. Where a meal doesn't come with a price tag of dignity. Where no one asks where you work, how you dress, or what you can offer. Just, are you hungry? And how can I serve you? Lance found that out. And maybe, just maybe, so did everyone watching him tonight. See, we live in a world obsessed with appearances, followers, brands, filters, labels. But none of it lasts. The real legacy we leave behind? It's in the moments no one records. The moments when kindness is inconvenient, when listening takes effort, when dignity is given, not earned. And tonight, in a room full of fine wine and whispered reputations, it was a simple act, a black card and a quiet truth that brought everything crashing down, but also everything up to the surface. And I hope you remember this when you choose to see people instead of status, when you pause before assuming someone's story, the employee, when you lead with empathy instead of ego. You don't just change someone else, you change yourself. I've been called many things in my life. Actor, recluse, gentleman, misfit, even myth. But the label I care about most is listener. Not because it's glamorous, but because it's real. Being a listener means stepping back. It means hearing what's not said, noticing what others overlook, and staying present even when the world wants you to rush past. In the quiet, we learn. In the silence, we grow. And in someone else's story, we sometimes find our own. Lance was never a villain. He was just another man trying to matter in a world that rewards the loudest voice. But tonight, when he returned not in arrogance, but humility, something shifted. Not just in him, but in everyone who watched. The staff, the guests, even the critics. Because we weren't witnessing a fall from grace. We were witnessing a rise into humanity. That's what second chances do. They don't erase the past. They give it a purpose. So I want to ask you something, from one listener to another. Have you ever been judged by how you looked? The clothes you wore, the job you had, the zip code on your mail? If you have, I see you. You're not alone. And maybe more importantly, what's one act of kindness you'll never forget? Something that changed you. Something that restored your faith when you needed it most. We're not here just to consume stories. We're here to add to them. So, share yours below. Tell us about that teacher who believed in you when no one else did. That stranger who paid for your groceries when your card declined. That hug that came at the exact right moment. Tell us your incredible story. Because the world doesn't need more critics, it needs more listeners, more hearts willing to sit at the table, even when the room feels too quiet, even when no one's watching, especially then. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if this story meant something to you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs it today. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, stay kind, stay curious, and stay listening.